going as well. How loud is that? I need to be quieter on my end. Interesting, that doesn't change. Makes sense. Oh, it does. Yeah, it sounds like a good mix. I'm just looking at the bar, where the bar is. Right, we haven't read on stream in a while. We are back with the Ethics of Liberty. And we're not terribly far from the end. Modern alternative theories of liberty might be fun. But also I'm looking forward to part 5. I quite like praxis stuff, but I'm not very good at doing it. Anyway, nature of the state, etc. Hey, thank you, Double Action Handicap X8, but I am not interested in paying for anything, really. I'm a stingy little man. Okay, anyway, the state versus liberty. So we've gotten through the theory of liberty that's laid out. Highlights were, I mean, the rights of animals chapter was very succinct. Problem of land theft, good insight. Same for land monopoly, past and present. I think children and rights was the weakest chapter. And I mean, bribery and the boycott were both straightforward. Also, property rights and theory contracts were quite good as well. Yeah, now we have the nature of the state. It's a fun topic. So far in this book, let me just watch my own stream real quick. Yeah. I don't know that tells me. So far in this book, we have developed a theory of liberty and property rights, and have outlined the legal code that would be necessary to defend those. What of government, the state? What is its proper role, if any? Actually, let's... Most people, including most political theorists, believe that once one considers or even the vital necessity of some particular activity of the state, such as the provision of a legal code, that one has ipso facto conceded the necessity of the state itself. The state indeed performs many important and necessary functions, from provision of law to the supply of police and firefighters. Sounds a bit dubious. Depends where you live. Some places it is a private thing. To building and maintaining the streets. Ooh, we hate public roads. I do have a particular gripe against public roads. I think Hopper laid out the case. I think it was in Oxford that failed. I'd need to double check. It's a historical case against roads. To delivery of the mail, just to serve. I'm not sure if our mail delivery is state run, but this in no way demonstrates that only the state can perform such functions, or indeed that it performs them even passably well. Suppose, for example, that there are many competing cantaloupe stores in a particular neighborhood, One of the cantaloupe dealers, Smith, then uses violence to drive all of his competitors out of the neighborhood. He has thereby employed violence to establish a coerced monopoly over the sale of cantaloupe in a given territorial area. Does that mean that Smith's use of force to establish and maintain his monopoly is essential to the provision of cantaloupe in the neighborhood? Certainly not, for there were existing competitors as well as potential rivals should Smith ever relax his use and threat of violence. Yeah. Moreover, economics demonstrates that Smith, as a coercive monopolist, will tend to perform his service badly and inefficiently. Protected from competition by the use of Smith can afford to provide his service in a costly and inefficient way. Consumers are deprived of any range of alternative choice. See Power and Market. I'm going to check if that's in the list. I have a list of things to read. And Power and Market is probably on there. Bookstore and stream there. Power, and there it is. Rothbard Power and Market. Furthermore, should a group arise to call for the abolition of Smith's coercive monopoly, there would be very few protesters with temerity abolitionists deprive the consumers of the much desired cantaloupe. And yet, the song sucks. What's going on here? Let's switch to the... Oh, nice. And yet, the state is only our hypothetical Smith. And yet, the state is only our hypothetical Smith on a gigantic and all-encompassing scale. Throughout history, groups of men calling themselves the government, the state, have attempted, usually successfully. I'm not going to say it's usually successful. That's a bit overbroad. Often successful. To gain a compulsory monopoly of the commanding heights of the economy and the society. In particular, the state has arrogated to itself a compulsory monopoly over police and military services, provision of law, judicial decision-making, the mint and the power to create money, unused land, the public domain, streets and highways, rivers and coastal waters, and the means of delivering mail. Control of land and transportation has long been an excellent method of assuring overall control of society. In many countries, highways began as a means of allowing the government troops conveniently throughout its subject country. Hopper talks about this. Control of the money supply is a way to assure the state an easy and rapid revenue, and the state makes sure that no private competitors are allowed to invade its self-arrogated monopoly of the power to counterfeit, i.e. create, money. Monopoly of the postal service has long been a convenient method for the state to keep an eye on possibly unruly, subversive opposition to its rule. Monopoly. In most historical epochs, the state has also kept a tight control over religion, usually cementing a comfortable mutual alliance with an established church. The state granting the priests power and wealth, and the church in turn teaching the subject population their divinely proclaimed duty to obey Caesar. That's complicated. But now that religion has lost much of its persuasive power in society, the state is often willing to let religion alone, and to concentrate on similar, if looser, alliance with more secular intellectuals. In either case, the state relies on control of the levers of propaganda to persuade its subjects to obey or even exalt their. But above all, the crucial monopoly is the state's control of the use of violence, the police and armed services, and of the courts, locus of ultimate decision-making power in disputes over crimes and control of the police and the army is particularly important in enforcing and assuring all of the state's other powers, including the all-important power to extract its revenue by coercion. For there is one crucially important power inherent in the nature of the state apparatus. All other persons and groups in society, except for acknowledged and sporadic criminals such as bank robbers, obtain their income voluntarily, either by selling goods and services to the public or by voluntary gift, the membership in a club or association, bequest, or inheritance. Only the state obtains its revenue by coercion, by threatening dire penalties should the income not be forthcoming. That coercion is taxation, although in less regularized epochs, often known as tribute. Taxation is theft purely and simply, even though it is theft on a grand and colossal scale, no acknowledged criminals could hope to make. There we have it. Taxation is theft. It is a compulsory seizure of the property of the state's inhabitants or subjects. It would be an instructive exercise for the skeptical reader to try to frame a definition of taxation which does not also include theft. Like the robber, the state demands money at the equivalent of gunpoint. If the taxpayer refuses to pay, his assets are taken by force. If he should resist such depredation, he will be arrested or shot if he should resist. It is true that state apologists maintain that taxation is really voluntary. One simple but instructive refutation of this claim is to ponder what would happen if the government were to abolish taxation and to confine itself to simple requests for voluntary contributions. Does anyone really believe that anything comparable to current vast revenues of the state would continue to pour into coffers? It is likely that even those theorists who claim that punishment never deters action would balk at such a claim. The great economist Joseph Schumpeter was correct when he acidly wrote that the theory which construes taxes as an analogy of club due or of the purchase of the services of, say, a doctor only proves how far removed this part of the social sciences is from the scientific habits of mind. That is scathing. It has been recently maintained by economists that taxation is really voluntary, because it is a method for everyone to make sure that everyone else pays for a unanimously desired project. Everyone in an area, for example, is assumed to desire the government to build the dam, but if A and B contribute voluntarily to the project, they cannot be sure to shirk their sympathy. Therefore, all of the individuals, A, B, etc., each of whom wish to contribute to building the dam, agree to coerce each other through taxation. Hence, the tax is not really coercion. There are, however, a great many flaws in this doctrine. Yeah, I don't want to pay for this stuff. That's the obvious one. No, I don't want the... I think the immediate example, I don't want the roads. I don't want the government coming along and, like, stealing the front couple meters from my parents' property. I mean, they haven't done that yet, but they've been like, oh, well, we can. We're just letting you know we can do that. Just in case. I don't want to pay taxes for... Anyway, First is the inner contradiction between voluntarism and coercion. A coercion of all against all does not make any of this coercion voluntary. Secondly, even if we assume for the moment that each individual would like to continue the dam, there is no way of assuring tax levied on each person is no more than he would be willing to pay voluntarily, even if everyone else. The government may levy $1,000 on Jones, even though he might have been willing to pay no more than $500. The point is that precisely because taxation is compulsory, there is no way to assure, as is done automatically on the market, that the amount any person can is what he would really be willing to pay. In the free society, a consumer who voluntarily buys a TV set for $200 demonstrates by his freely chosen action that the TV set is worth more to him than the $200 he spent. In short, he demonstrates that the $200 is a voluntary payment. Or a club member in the society, by paying annual due $200, demonstrates that he considers the benefits of club membership worth at least $200. But in the case of taxation, a man's surrender to the threat of coercion demonstrates no voluntary preference whatsoever. Alleged benefits received. Oh, we got a third and a fourthly. Nice. We love thirdlies. Fourthly, I think your thirdlies are the peak one, but then fourthly, you know, things come in threes. Thirdly, the argument proves far too much. For the supply of any service, not only dams, can be expanded by the use of tax financing arm. Suppose, for example, Catholic Church were established in a country through taxation. Catholic Church would undoubtedly be larger than if it relied on voluntary contributions. But can it therefore be argued that such establishment is really voluntary, because everyone wants to coerce everyone else in paying into the church, in order to make sure that no one jerks this? Fourthly, the argument is simply a mystical. How can anyone know that everyone else is really paying his tax voluntarily on the strength of this sophistical argument? What of those people, environmentalists, who are opposed to dams per se, is their payment really voluntary? Would the coerced payments of taxes to a Catholic church by Protestants or atheists also be voluntary? What of the growing body of libertarians in our society who oppose all actions by the government on principle? What way can this argument hold that their tax payments are really voluntary? In fact, the existence of at least one libertarian or anarchist in a country is enough by itself to demolish the really voluntary argument of taxation. It is also contended that, in democratic governments, the act of voting makes the government and all its works and powers truly voluntary. Again, there are many fallacies with this popular argument. In the first place, even if the majority of the public specifically endorsed every particular act of government, this would simply be majority tyranny rather than a voluntary act undergone by every person in the country. Murder is murder, theft is theft, whether undertaken by one man against another or by a group, or even by the majority of people within a given territorial area. The fact that a majority might support or condone an act of theft does not diminish the criminal essence of the act or its grave injustice. Otherwise, we would have to say, for example, that any Jews murdered under the democratically elected Nazi government but not murdered, but only voluntarily committed suicide. Fully the grotesque but logical implication of the democracy as voluntary doctrine. Secondly, in a republic, as contrasted to a direct democracy, people vote not for specific measures but for representatives. Package D. Representatives then their will for a fixed length of time. In no legal sense of are they truly representatives, since in a free society, the principal hires his agent or representative individually and can fire him at will. As the great anarchist political theorist and constitutional lawyer Lysander Spooner, they, the elected government officials, are neither our servants, agents, attorneys, nor representatives, for we do not make ourselves responsible for their acts. If a man is my servant, agent, or attorney, I necessarily make myself responsible for all his acts done within the limits of the power I have entrusted to him. If I have entrusted him as my agent with either absolute power or any power at all over the persons or property of other men than myself, I thereby necessarily make myself responsible to those other persons for any injuries he may do them, so long as he acts within the limits of the power I have granted to him. But no individual may be in personal property by acts of Congress can come to the individual electors and hold them responsible for these acts of their so-called agents or. This fact proves that the pretended agents of the people, of everybody, are really the agents of. Furthermore, even on its own term, voting can hardly establish majority rule, much less of voluntary endorsement of government. In the United States, for example, less than 40% of voters bother to vote at all. Of these, 21% may vote for one candidate and for another. 21% scarcely establishes the majority rule, much less the voluntary consent of all. In one sense, and quite apart from democracy or voting, majority always supports government. This will be treated below. And finally, how is it that taxes are levied on one and all, regardless of whether they voted or not? Or, more particularly, whether they voted for the winning candidate? How can either non-voting or voting for the loser indicate any sort of endorsement of the actions of the elected government? Neither does voting establish any sort of voluntary consent, even by the voters themselves, to the government, as Spooner trenchantly pointed out. In truth, in the case of individuals, their actual voting is not to be taken as. On the contrary, it is to be considered that, without his consent having even been asked, a man finds himself environed by a government that he cannot resist, a government that pay money, render service, forego the exercise of many under peril of weighty punishments. He sees, too, that other men practice this tyranny over him by the use of the ballot. He sees further that if he will but use the ballot himself, he has some chance of relieving himself from this tyranny of others by subjecting them to his own. In short, he finds himself, without his consent, so situated that, if he uses the ballot, he may become a master. Not use it, he must become a slave, and he has no other alternative than these. In self-defense, attempts the former. His case is analogous to that of a man who has been forced into battle, where he must either kill others or be killed himself, because, to save his own life in battle, a man attempts to take the lives of his opponent. It is not to be inferred that the battle is one of his own choosing, neither in contests with the ballot, which is a mere substitute for a bullet, because as is his only chance of a man uses a ballot, to be inferred that the consent is one which he that he voluntarily set up all his own natural rights as a stake against those of others, lost or won by the mere power of numbers. Doubtless the most miserable of men, under the most oppressive government in the world, if allowed the ballot, would use it. if they could see any chance of ameliorating their condition, but it would not therefore be a legitimate inference that the government itself that crushes them was one which they had voluntarily set up or entered to. If, then, taxation is compulsory, it is therefore indistinguishable from theft, it follows that the state, which subsists on taxation, is a vast criminal organization far more formidable and successful than any private mafia in history. Furthermore, it should be considered criminal not only according to the theory of crime and property rights as set forth in this book, but even according to the common apprehension of mankind, which always considers theft to be a crime, as we have seen above. The 19th century German sociologist Franz Oppenheimer put the matter succinctly when he pointed out that there are two and only two ways of attaining wealth in society. This again, yep. The economic means and the political means. We go A. By production and voluntary exchange with others, method of the free market, and B. By violent expropriation of the wealth produced by others. The latter is the method of violence and theft. The former benefits all parties involved. The latter parasitically benefits the looting group class at the expense of the loot. Oppenheimer trenchantly termed the former method of obtaining wealth the economic and the latter the political means. Oppenheimer then went on brilliantly to define the state as the organization of the political means. Nowhere has the essence of the state as a criminal organization put as forcefully or as brilliantly as in this passage from Sanders Spooner. We're getting all the quotes today. All the quotes we can dream of. It is true that the theory of our Constitution is that all taxes are paid voluntarily. Our government is a mutual insurance company, voluntarily entered into by the people with each other. But this theory of our government is wholly different from. The fact is that the government, like a highwayman, says to a man, your money or your life, and many, if not most, taxes are paid under the compulsion of that threat. The government does not indeed waylay a man in a lonely place, spring upon him from and, holding a pistol to his head, proceed to rifle his pockets. But the robbery is none the less a robbery on that account, and it is far more dastardly and shameful. The highwayman takes solely upon himself the responsibility, danger, and crime of his own act. He does not pretend that he has any rightful claim to your money, or that he intends to use it for your own benefit. He does not pretend to be anything but a robber. He has not acquired impudence enough to protect, and that he takes men's money against their will merely to enable him to protect those infatuated travelers. He'll perfectly able to protect themselves, not appreciate his particular system of protection. He is too sensible a man to make such professions as these. Furthermore, having taken your money, he leaves as you wish him to do. He does not persist in following you on the will, assuming to be your rightful sovereign on account of the protection he affords. He does not keep protecting you by commanding you to bow down and serve him, by requiring you to do this and by robbing you of more money as often as he finds it pleasure to do, and by branding you as a rebel, a traitor, and an enemy to your country, putting you down without mercy if you disobey authority. He is too much of a gentleman to be guilty of such impostures and villainies as these. In short, he does not, in addition to robbing you, attempt to make you either his dupe or his slave. It is instructive to inquire why it is that the state, in contrast to the highwaymen, invariably surrounds itself with an ideology of legitimacy. Why it must indulge in all the hypocrisies that Spooner outlines. The reason is that the highwayman, a visible, permanent, legal, legitimate member of society, let alone a member with exalted, is always on the run from his victim or from the state itself, but the state, in contrast to a band of highwaymen, is not considered a criminal organization. On the contrary, its minions have generally held the position of highest status in society. It is a status that allows the state to feed off its victim, while making at least most of them support or at least resign to this exploitative process. In fact, it is precisely the function of the state's ideological allies to explain to the public that the emperor does indeed find set of. In brief, the ideologist must explain while theft by one or more persons or groups is bad and criminal, that when the state engages in such acts, not theft, but the legitimate and even sanctified act called taxation. Ideologists must explain that murder by one or more groups is bad and must be punished, but that when the state kills, it is not murder but an exalted act of war or repression of subversion of private individual groups. That when the state commits acts not kidnapping, slavery, but conscription, an act necessary to public weal and even to the requirements of morality itself. The function of the statist ideologist is to weave the false set of emperor's clothes, convince the public of a massive double standard, that when the state commits the gravest of high crimes, it is really not doing so, but doing something else that is necessary, proper, vital, and even, in former ages, by divine command. Age-old success of the ideologist of the state is perhaps the most gigantic of mankind. Ideology has always been vital to the continued existence of the state, as attested by the systematic use of ideology in the ancient Oriental Empire. The specific content of the ideology has, of course, changed over time, in accordance with changing conditions. In the Oriental despotisms, the emperor was often held by the church to be himself divine. In our more secular age, the argument runs more to the public good and the general welfare. But the purpose is always the same: to convince the public that what the state does is not, as one might think, crime on a gigantic scale, but something necessary and vital, must be supported and obeyed. The reason that ideology is so vital to the state is that it always rests, in essence, on the support of the majority of the public. This support obtains whether the state is a democracy, a dictatorship, or an absolute monarchy. The support rests in the willingness of the majority, not, to repeat, of every individual, to go along with the system, to pay the taxes, go without much complaint, to fight the state's war, to obey the state's rules. This support need not be active enthusiasm to be effective. It can just as well be passive resignation. But support there must be, for if the bulk of the public were really convinced of the illegitimacy of the state, if it were convinced the state is nothing more or less than a bandit gang writ large, then the state would soon collapse, take on no more status or breadth of existence. Other mafia gang. Then another. Hence the necessity of the state's employment of ideologists, and hence the necessity of the state's age-old alliance with the court intellectuals, with the apologia for state rule. The first modern political theorist who saw that all states rest on majority opinion, 16th century libertarian French writer Etienne de la Boétie in his discourse on voluntary servitude. Ooh, let's add that. De la Boétie discourse on voluntary servitude. I see the De La Boétie quotes in this all the time, and they're really I say I don't know, punchy? Not quite the right word. They got oomph, panache, certain je ne sais quoi, as you might say. It does sound French. De La Boétie saw that the tyrannical state is always a minority of the population, and that therefore its continued despotic rule must rest on its legitimacy in the eyes of the exploited majority. What would later come to be called engineering of consent. 200 years later, David Hume, though scarcely a libertarian, set forth a similar analysis, counter-argument that, with modern weapons, a minority force can permanently cow a hostile majority, ignores the fact that these weapons can be held by the majority, and that the armed force of the minority can mutiny or defect to the side of the populace. Hence, the permanent need for persuasive ideology has always led the state to bring into its rubric the nation's opinion-molding intellectual. In former days, the intellectuals were invariably the priests, and hence, as we have pointed out, the age-old alliance between church and state thrown an altar. Nowadays, scientific, value-free economists and national security managers, among others, perform a similar ideological function in behalf of state power. Value-free economy. That's on there. Particularly important in the modern world, now that an established church is often no longer feasible, is for the state to assume control over education and thereby to mold the minds of its subjects. In addition to influencing universities through all manner of financial and through state-owned universities directly, the state controls education at lower levels, universal and public school, certification requirements for private school, and through compulsory attendance. Add to this a virtually total control over radio and television, either through outright state ownership, as in most countries, or as in the United States, by the nationalization of the airwaves, and by the power of a federal commission to license the right of stations was free. That was not age well. United States has very poor control of just because it's very decentralized, because they got some influence, but it doesn't seem to be the same sort of thing where it's like, well, 10 TV channels each. Thus, the state, by its very nature, must violate the generally accepted moral laws most people adhere. Most people are agreed on the injustice and inequality of murder and theft. Customs, rules, and law of all societies action. State, then, is always in a vulnerable position, despite its seeming age-old might. What particularly needs to be done is to enlighten the public on the state's truth, so that they can see that the state habitually violates the generally accepted injunctions of robbery and murder. That the state is the necessary violator of the commonly accepted moral and criminal. We have seen clearly why the state needs the intellectual. Why did the intellectual state? Put simply, it is because intellectual services are often not very intensively desired by the mass of consumers and find a more secure market for their abilities in the arms of the state can provide them with a power, status, and wealth which they often cannot obtain in voluntary. For centuries, many, though of course not all, intellectuals sought the goal of power, the realization of the Platonic ideal of the philosopher. Consider, for example, Cry from the Heart by the distinguished Marxist scholar Professor Needham. Protest against the acidulous critique by Karl Wittfogel of the alliance of state and intellectual in Oriental despotism. The civilization which Professor Wittfogel so bitterly attacking was one which could make poets and scholars into officials. Successive Chinese emperors were served in all ages by a great company of profoundly humane and disinterested scholars. Presumably, for Professor Needham, this is enough to justify the grinding despotism of the ancient Orient. But we need not go back as far as the ancient Orient, or even as far as the proclaimed goal of the professors at the University of Berlin in the century, form themselves into the intellectual bodyguard of House Hohenzollern. In contemporary America, we have the eminent political scientist Professor Richard Newsom hailing the president as the sole crown-like symbol. We have National Security Manager Townsend Hoop writing that under our system, people can look only to the president to define the nature of our foreign policy problem and the national programs and sacrifices required to meet effectiveness. And in response, we have Richard Nixon, on the eve of his election as president, defining his role as follows. He, the president, must articulate the nation's values, define its goals, and marshal it. Nixon's conception of his role is hauntingly similar to scholar Ernst Huber's articulation in the Germany of 1930s of the constitutional law of the Greater German Reich. Huber wrote that the head of state sets up the great ends which are to be obtained, and draws up the plans for the utilization of all national powers in the achievement of the common goals, gives the national life its true purpose and value. Thus, the state is a coercive criminal organization that subsists by a regularized large-scale system of taxation and theft, and which gets away with it by engineering the support of the majority, securing an alliance with a group of opinion-molding intellectuals whom it rewards with a share in its power and pelf. Fuck is pelf? Pelf? Money. Archaic money. Okay. It's a fun line though. I'm just gonna make the post on Facebook, see if I get. Figure out. Which gets away with it by nearing the support of the majority through securing alliance with a holding whom it rewards with a in power and health. Add a cute animal. There we go. Anyway, banger. But there is another vital aspect of the state that needs. There is one critical argument for the state that now comes into view, namely the implicit argument that the state apparatus really and properly owns the territorial area over which it claims jurisdiction. The state, in short, arrogates to itself a monopoly of force, ultimate decision-making power over a given territorial area, larger or smaller depending on conditions, and on how much it has been able to wrest from other states. If the state may be said to properly own its territory, then it is proper for it to make rules for anyone who presumes to live in that area. It can legitimately control private property because there is no private property in the area, because it really owns the entire land surface. So long as the state permits the subject to territory, it can be said to act as does any other owner who sets down rules for living on property. This seems to be the only justification for the crude slogan, America, love it or leave it. We sort of moved past that exact framing. Oh hey, we got a one on Twitch so I can ban easier. Go. Sorry, you're not allowed to be in my chat. This is a no chat zone. As well as the enormous emphasis generally placed on an individual's right to immigrate from a country. In short, this theory makes the state, as well as the king in the Middle Ages, a feudal overlord, who at least theoretically owned all the land in his domain. The fact that new and unowned resources, whether virgin land or land, are invariably by the state, its public domain, is an expression of this implicit theory, but our homesteading theory, outlined above, suffices to demolish any such pretension by the state apparatus. For by what earthly right do the criminals of the state lay claim to the ownership of its land area? It is bad enough that they have seized control of ultimate decisions for that area. What criterion can give them the rightful ownership of the entire territory? The state may therefore be defined as that organization which possesses either or both, in actual fact almost always both, of the following characteristics. A. It acquires its revenue by physical coercion, taxation, and B. It achieves a compulsory monopoly of force and of ultimate power over a given territorial area. Both of these essential activities of the state necessarily constitute criminal aggression and depredation of the just rights of private property of its subjects, including self-ownership. For the first constitutes and establishes theft on a grand scale, while the second prohibits free competition of defense and taking agencies within a given territorial area, prohibiting the voluntary purchase and sale of defense and services. Hence, the justice of the vivid critique of the state by the libertarian theorist Albert J. Nock. The state claims and exercises the monopoly of crime. in a given territorial area. It forbids private murder, but itself organizes murder on a colossal scale. It punishes private theft, but itself lays unscrupulous hands on it, whether the property of citizen or alien. It must be emphasized that the state does not merely use coercion to acquire its own revenue, hire propagandists to advance its power, and to arrogate to itself, and to enforce a complete monopoly of such vital services: police protection, firefighting, transportation, and postal service. For the state does many other things as well, none of which can in any sense be said to serve the public. It uses its monopoly of force to achieve, as Nock puts it, a monopoly of crime. Control, regulate, and coerce its hapless subjects. Often it pushes its way into controlling the morality and the very daily lives of its subjects. The state uses its coerced revenue not merely to monopolize and provide genuine services sufficiently to the public, also to build up its own power at the expense of its exploited and harassed subjects, to redistribute income from the public to itself and to its allies, and to control, command, and coerce the inhabitants of. In a truly free society where individual rights of person and property are maintained, the state then would necessarily its myriad of invasive and aggressive activities, its vast depredations on the rights of person and property would then disappear. At the same time, those genuine services which it does manage badly would be thrown open to free competition and to voluntarily chosen payments by individual consumers. The grotesquerie of the typical conservative call government to enforce conservative definitions of morality, e.g. by outlawing the alleged immorality of pornography, is therefore starkly revealed. Aside from other sound arguments for morality, that no action not freely chosen can be moral, it is surely grotesque to entrust the function of guardian of the public morality, most extensive criminal, and hence the most immoral group in society, the state. Excellent click. Open as it. Oh, bam. Out of the way. Next up, the inner contradictions of the state. This one's not a terribly long chapter. Go through this entire thing. Not the entire rest of the book, but like just the entirety of part 3. Yo, Sadi Hani, how's it going? No, you cannot be my video editor. I'm not making videos. I'm not making videos, though. I don't need a video editor. Sorry. Not really a video guy. I should be a video guy, but I'm just not. Got it. Yeah, appreciate the offer. Best of luck finding clients elsewhere. And have a good one. I mean, I'm presuming you're not going to stick around. People don't tend to. Try to sell me something. I guess not sell, but you know. Anyway, we're on to the inner contradictions of the state. A major problem with discussions of the necessity of government is the fact that all such discussions necessarily take place in the context of centuries of state existence and state rule. Rule to which the public has become habituated. The wry coupling of the twin certainties of the popular motto, death and taxes, demonstrates that the public has resigned itself to the existing state as an evil but inescapable nature, which there is no alternative. Force of habit as the cement of state rule, seen as early as the 16th century writings, Della Boesi. Here we go again, my boy Della Boesi. You know what? Alcohol time. I should have grabbed a drink earlier, but I got Johnny Walker Red Label, which is an alcohol. Hell yeah. What's my hair doing? Get out of here. A shape. Well. Okay, anyway, death and taxes. Della Boesi. But logically, and to cast off the scales of habit, must not merely compare an existing state with an unknown quantity, but begin at the social zero point, logical fiction of the state of nature, and compare the relative arguments for the establishment of the state with those on behalf of a free society. This might be a good, I'm saving this in my mind. This might be a good chapter to point people when they argue for the necessity. Um, Alright, let us assume, for example, that a sizable number of people suddenly arrive on Earth, and that they must now consider what sort of social arrangements to live under. One person or group of persons argues as follows, i.e. the typical argument for the state. Each of us is allowed to remain free in all aspects, and particularly if each of us is allowed to retain weapons and the right of self-defense, then we will all war against each other. Society will be... Therefore, let us turn over all of our guns and all of our ultimate power and power to define and enforce our rights to the Jones family of it. The Jones family will guard us from our predatory instincts, keep social peace, and enforce justice. Is it conceivable that anyone, except perhaps the Jones family itself, would spend one moment considering this clearly absurd scheme? The cry of who would guard us from the Jones family, especially when we are deprived of our weapons, would suffice to shout down such a thing. And yet, given the acquisition of from the fact of longevity, given the long-time rule of Jones family, it's precisely the type of argument which we now blindly. Employing the logical model of the state of nature aids us in casting off the fetters of habit we see the state plain. and to see that the emperor indeed bears no claim. If, in fact, we cast a cold and logical eye theory of limited government, we can see it for the chimera that it really is, unrealistic and inconsistent utopia that it holds forth. In the first place, there is no reason to assume that a compulsory monopoly of violence, once acquired by the Jones family or by any state ruler, remain limited to protection of person and property. Certainly, historically, no government has long remained limited, and there are excellent reasons to suppose that it never will. First, once the cancerous principle of coercion, forced revenue, and compulsory monopoly of violence is established and legitimated at the very heart of society, there is every reason to suppose that this precedent will be expanded and embellished. In particular, it is in the economic interest of the state rule to work actively for such expansion. The more the coercive powers of the state are expanded beyond the cherished limits of the laissez-faire theorist, the greater the power and health accruing of the ruling caste operating the state apparatus. Hence, ruling caste eager to maximize its power and wealth will stretch state power, and will encounter only feeble opposition. Given the legitimacy it and its allied intellectuals are gaining, and given the lack of any free market channels of resistance to the government's monopoly coercion and the power of ultimate decision making. Big words. Thank you, boss. On the free market, it is a happy fact that the maximization of the wealth of one group or one person or group redounds to the benefit of all, but in the political realm of the state, a maximization of income and wealth can accrue parasitically to the state and its rulers at the expense of the rest of society. Advocates of a limited government often hold up the ideal of a government above the fray, refraining from taking sides or throwing its weight around, an umpire, arbitrating impartially between contending factions in society. Yet, why should the government do so? Given the unchecked power of the state and its rulers will act to maximize their power and wealth, and hence inexorably expand beyond the supposed limits. The crucial point is that in the utopia of limited government, laissez-faire, there are no institutional mechanisms to keep the state limited. Surely the bloody record of states throughout history demonstrated that any power, once granted or acquired, will be used and therefore abused. Power corrupts, as the libertarian Lord Acton so wisely noted. Furthermore, apart from the absence of institutional mechanism, hey, it sounds like you're promoting something. Rosto. I'm not, I know you say you're not trying to promote anything, but, you know. Also, I hate sports. I don't want to bet on them. This is an anti-gambling channel. Okay? Firmly anti-gambling. Actually, just gonna... over here. Yeah, okay. Where was I? Tried to ban that guy for shilling gambling. I mean, that's obviously a scam, but like, gambling, gross. Anyway. Furthermore, apart from the absence of instant mechanism to keep the ultimate decision maker and force wielder limited to protection of rights, there is a grave inner contradiction inherent in the very ideal of a neutral or impartial state, for there can be no such thing as a neutral tax. A taxing system is neutral to the market as it would have been without taxation. This is not video game music, this is adventure. As John C. Calhoun from Black Mesa trenchantly pointed out in the early 19th century, the very existence of taxation negates any possibility of such neutrality. For, given any level of taxation, the least that will happen will be the creation of antagonistic social classes. Ruling classes who gain by and live off taxation, and the classes who pay the taxes. In short, conflicting classes of net taxpayers and net tax consumers. At the very least, the government bureaucrats will necessarily be net tax consumers. Other such will be those persons and groups subsidized by the inevitable expenditures of government. As Calhoun put it, agents and employees of the government constitute that portion of the are the exclusive recipients of the proceeds of the taxes. Whatever amount is taken from the community in the form of taxes, if not lost, goes to them in the shape of expenditures and disbursements. The two, disbursements and taxation, constitute the fiscal action of the government. They are correlatives. What the one takes from the under the name of taxes transferred to the portion of the recipient under that of disbursements. But as the recipients constitute a portion of the community, it follows, taking the two parts of the fiscal process together, that its action must be unequal between the payers of the taxes and the recipients of their proceeds. Nor can it be otherwise, unless what is collected from individual in the shape of taxes be returned to him in that of disbursements. Make the process nugatory and absurd. Quite. Necessary result, then, of the unequal fiscal action of the government by the community great classes. One consisting of those who, in reality, pay the taxes, and of course bear exclusively the burden of supporting the government, and the other of those who are the recipients of their proceeds through disbursements, and who are supported by the government, or, in fewer words, divided into taxpayers and tax consumers. But the effect of this is to place them in antagonistic relations in reference to the fiscal action of the government, and the entire course of policy therewith connected. For the greater the taxes and disbursements, the greater the gain of the one, and vice versa. The effect, then, of every increase is to enrich and strengthen the one, and impoverish and weaken the other. Calhoun goes on to point out that a constitution will not be able to keep government, or given a monopoly court selected by the self-same government and granted the power of ultimate decision-making, the political ends will always favor a broad or loose interpretation of the wording of the decision to expand the powers of government over the citizenry, and over time the ends will inexorably tend to win out over the minority of outs, argue vainly for strict state power. Good thing that it's a lifetime appointment. Like, it's one of the few things that they sort of got right. Because if it was changing constantly, you'd have people with a narrow window to exercise the control over the Constitution. But there are other fatal flaws. The concept of limited laissez-faire government. In the first place, it is generally accepted by limited government and by other political philosophers that the state is necessary for the creation and development of law, but this is historically incorrect. For most law, but especially the most libertarian parts of the law, emerged not from the state but out of non-state institutions. Tribal custom, common law judges in courts, the law merchant in mercantile courts, or admiralty law tribunals set up by shippers themselves. In the case of competing common law judges, as well as elders or tribes, the judges were not engaged in making the law, but in finding the law in existing and generally accepted principles, and then applying that law to specific cases or to new technological. The same was true in private Roman law. Moreover, in ancient Ireland, society existed for 1,000 years until conquest by Cromwell. There was no trace of state-administered justice. Competing schools, professional jurists interpreted and applied the common body of customary, with enforcement undertaken by competing and voluntarily supported Watha, or insurance agents. Damn. Okay, so we got a historical case. Stateless societies, ancient Ireland. Screen. Snipping tool. That sounds a lot of fun. A lot of quotes there. A lot of references. Furthermore, these customary rules were not haphazard or arbitrary, but consciously rooted in natural law, discoverable by man's reason. But in addition to the historical inaccuracy of the view that the state is needed for the development of law, Randy Barnett has brilliantly pointed out that the state, by its very nature, cannot obey its own legal rule. But if the state cannot obey its own legal rule, it is necessarily deficient and self-contradictory as a maker of law. In an exegesis and critique of Lon L. Fuller's seminal work, The Morality of Law, Barnett notes that Professor Fuller sees in the current thinking of legal positivism a persistent error. The assumption that law should be viewed as a one-way projection of authority, originating with government and imposing itself upon the citizen. Fuller points out that law is not simply vertical, command from above, from the state to its citizens, but also horizontal, rising from among the people themselves and applied to each other. Fuller points to international law, tribal law, private rule, etc., as pervasive examples of such reciprocal and state law. Fuller sees the positivist error as stemming from failure to recognize a crucial principle of proper law, namely that the lawmaker should itself obey its own rule that it lays down for its citizens, or, in Fuller's words, that enacted law itself presupposes a commitment by the government authority to abide by its own rule dealing with its subjects. Actually, that checks. Because if the law is true, and the government believes the law is true, then they ought to follow it. But Barnett correctly points out that Fuller errs significantly in failing to apply his own principle far enough, in limiting the principle to the procedural rules by which law is passed, rather than applying it to the substance of the laws themselves. Because of this failure to carry his principle to its logical conclusion, Fuller fails to see the inherent inner contradiction of the state as maker of. As Barnett puts it, Fuller fails in his attempt because he has not followed his own principle far enough. If he did, see that the state legal system does not conform to the principle of official congruence with its own rules. It is because the positivists see that the state inherently violates its own rules that they conclude, in a sense correctly, that state-made law is sui generis. What is sui generis? Come on, man. Give me sui generis. Unique. Okay. Unique. Okay, it's a thing of its own. In a class by itself. Got it. Man. Latin, am I right, guys? Let's check something. Sorry, I'm typing Facebook comment about pineapples. I don't love pineapple. Anyway, we got to sui generis, and that threw me off because I don't fucking know that. But yeah, in Man, my brain is fogging up. There's alcohol. Of its own kind. However, Barnett adds, if Fuller's principle were carried forward to assert that the lawmaker must obey the substance of his own law, then Fuller would see that the state by its nature must violate this commitment. For Barnett correctly points out that the two unique essential features of the state are its power to tax, to acquire its revenue by coercion and hence robbery, and to prevent its subjects from hiring any other defense agency, voluntary monopoly of defense. But in doing so, the state violates its own laws that it sets down for its subjects, as Barnett explains. For example, the state says that citizens may not take from another by force and against his will that which belongs to another, and yet the state, through its power to tax legitimately, does just that. More essentially, the state says that a person may use force upon another only in self-defense, i.e., only as a defense against another who initiated the use. To go beyond one's right of self-defense would be to aggress on the rights of others, a violation of one's legal duty, and yet the state, by its claimed monopoly, forcibly imposes its jurisdiction on persons who may have done nothing wrong. By doing so, it aggresses against the rights of its citizens, something which its rules say citizens may not do. The state, in short, may steal where its subjects may. It may aggress, initiate the use against its subjects while prohibiting them having the same right. It is to this that the positivists look when they say the law, meaning state-made law, is a one-way vertical process. It is this that belies any claim of true reciprocity. Barnett concludes that, interpreted consistently, Fuller's principle means that in a true and proper legal system, the lawmaker must follow all of its rules, procedural and substantive alike. Therefore, to the degree that it does not and cannot do this, it is not and cannot be a legal system, and its acts are outside the law. The state qua state, therefore, is an illegal system. Another inner contradiction of the theory of laissez-faire government deals again with taxation. For if government is to be limited to protection of person and property, and taxation is to be limited to providing that service only, then how is the government to decide how much protection to provide and how much taxes to levy? For, contrary to the limited government theory, protection is not a collective one lump thing in any other good or service in society. Suppose, for example, that we might offer a competing theory. That government should be limited to supplying clothing free to all of its citizens, but this would scarcely be any sort of viable limit. Apart from other flaws in the theory, or how much clothing, what cost? Must everyone be supplied with Balenciaga Original, for example? And who is to decide how much, what quality of clothing each person is to receive? Indeed, protection could conceivably imply anything from one policeman for an entire country, supplying an armed bodyguard and a tank for every citizen. A proposition which would bankrupt the society post-haste. We're getting to that point. Bodyguard and actually, does the bodyguard get a bodyguard? Because I mean, bodyguards are still citizens. Okay, ignore that. Bit of a silly question. But yeah, bodyguard and a tank. I'd like a bodyguard and a tank. I don't know about you guys. But I mean, I'd be happy to pay for a tank and have like a buddy bodyguard each other. Bodyguard. That'd be a good movie name. movie where a guy hires his best friend who's like unemployable be his bodyguard, and it follows a thing where like the friend actually takes it seriously and he discovers some kind of threat, but the guy that he's but the friend that hired him is in a position where he can't see the threat, and he sort of reacts like, hey, you're kind of getting paranoid about this stuff, I gotta let you off, man. But then his friend actually like does the stuff he needs to do. I'm gonna write this down actually. So let's this is very strange, but like through it. Let's go story premise. Buddy God. And then we go to normal text. Two people. Bill. Adam. Bill's a bit of a waster. Basically unemployable. Hey, I've gotten this thing about odd jams before, but sports betting is gay as hell, and I'm gonna like ban you because I hate sports betting in particular. Okay? Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying I don't believe you about this method, but like it's pretty gay whatever you're doing, so get out of here. Also, if any like moderators are looking at what I said, on Kick is just shilling a totally profitable, guaranteed 40k a month sports betting scheme. Definite scam. I'm just trying to be like a silly guy about it. Anyway. Pity is Bill. Yeah. Oh yeah. Bill on to a team against Adam. But through some but Adam doesn't believe him. Kind of by him. Bill then has to act in his own way against the threat. After some, it's a bit embarrassing, antic. Okay. Bodyguard. They're good friends. They get along. But Adam's like, you know, they grew up together. Bill stays a waster. Adam majors in like business, and he actually gets like a real job where he's an important person. Like sometimes your friends, you know, they matter. And Bill's down on his luck. He can't hold a job down. He's just one of those guys. Heart of gold. Nerves of spaghetti. But he's, you know, probably a fairly large guy. Tired. Yeah, I mean, it's a... Do what you can. Poor Bill. I'm choosing the name Adam and Bill because they're AB. I'm gonna keep using those as generic stand-in names. Also, I'm getting a stutter because of the alcohol. Speaking of alcohol, I'm gonna pour it this way. So. Johnny Walker Red Label, not sponsoring the stream, because why would they sponsor the stream? And we are back to the inner contradictions of the day. For how much clothing? Balenciaga. And also, Balenciaga, a specific reference to a company, brings up the question, to whom do the contracts to provide security go to? That's, you know, a worthwhile question. Although that is also part of the who is to decide how much. And what quality, like, quality is nebulous. Because quality is a multimodal. Is that the right term? Many things are multimodal. Characterized by several different modes of activity or occurrence. Yeah. I'm gonna stick with that. Multimodal. There's also different ways that something can have quality. You know? Multifaceted? That's probably one way. So like something can be durable, but it can also be comfortable. It can be aesthetically pleasing. It can be warm. You know, it can be like loose, you know, it can be like something that's good for running in. It can be something that's good for formal events or like casual wear. Anyway. But who is to decide on how much protection? And since it is undeniable that every person would be better protected from theft and assault if provided with an armed bodyguard than if... on the free market, decisions of how much and what quality of any good or service should be supplied to each person are made by means of voluntary purchases by each individual. But what criterion can be applied when the decision is by government? The answer is none at all, and such governmental decisions can only be arbitrary? Purely arbitrary. I don't think it's purely arbitrary. I think it's somewhat arbitrary. Arbitrary in a way that matters. Okay, well, anyway, secondly, one searches in vain in the writings of laissez-faire theorists for a cogent theory of taxation. Not only how much taxation is to be levied, but also who is to be forced to pay. Commonly adopted ability to pay theory, for example, is, as the libertarian Frank Chodorov pointed out, philosophy of the highway robber to extract as much loot from the victim as the robber can get away with. Scarcely a cogent social philosophy, and at total variance, of course, from the system of payment on the free market. For if everyone were forced to pay for every good and service in proportion to his income, then there would be no pricing system at all, and no market system would work. David Rockefeller, for example, might be forced to pay $1 million for a loaf of bread. Which is a pretty funny idea. Although, if David Rockefeller were buying bread for someone else, which is also peculiar, like, I don't know, brain's getting a bit... Ooh. Next, no laissez-faire writer has ever provided a theory of the size of the state. If the state is to have a compulsory monopoly of force in a given territorial area, how large is that area to be? These theorists have not given full attention to the fact that the world has always lived in an international anarchy, with no government or compulsory monopoly of decision-making between various countries. And yet, international relations between private citizens of different countries have generally functioned quite smoothly, despite the lack of a single government over them. Thus, a contractual or a tort dispute between a citizen of North Dakota and of Manitoba is usually handled quite smoothly, typically with the plaintiff suing or placing charges in, and the court of the other country recognizing the result. Wars and conflicts usually take place between governments rather than the private citizens of the various countries. Real. But more profoundly, would a laissez-fairist recognize the right of a region of the country to secede from that country? Is it legitimate for West Ruritania? Yay, Ruritania is back. Yeah, we love Ruritania. Woo! Yeah! To secede from Ruritania. If not, why not? And if so, then how can there be a logical stopping point to the secession? May not a small district secede, and then a city, then a borough of that city, a block, and then finally a particular individual? Once admit any right of succession whatever, and there is no logical stopping point short of the right of individual succession, which logically entails anarchism, since the individuals may secede and patronize their own defense agency, and the state has crumbled. Finally, there is a crucial inconsistency. Preferred criterion of laissez-faire itself, limiting the government to protection of person and property. For if it is legitimate for a government to tax, why not tax its subjects to provide other goods and services that may be used? Why shouldn't the government, for example, build steel plants, provide shoes, dams, post services, etc.? For each of these goods and services is useful to. If the laissez-faireists object that the government should not build steel plants or shoe factories, provide them to consumers, either free or for sale, because tax coercion had been employed in constructing these plants, well then, the same objection can of course be made to governmental police or judicial services. The government should be acting no more immorally, laissez-faire point of view, when providing housing or steel than when providing police protection. Get owned. I was a laissez-faire, so, we'll grow up. Government limited to protection, then, cannot be sustained even within the laissez-faire ideal itself, much less from any other consideration. It is true that the laissez-faire ideal could still be employed to prevent such second-degree coercive activity of government, i.e., coercion beyond the initial coercion of taxation, as price control or outlawry of pornography. But the limits have now become flimsy indeed, and may be stretched to virtually complete collectivism, in which the government only supplies goods and services, yet supplies all of them. One 183, 189. Yeah, I want you reading. I'm enjoying this, actually. I'm thoroughly enjoying this shit. Right, the question. Okay, so, it was someone made a comment. No, someone made a post about how if Bruce Wayne just provided UBI to the Gotham, then he wouldn't have to spend so much time crime fighting. And the obvious objection is that, like, basically no one in his entire rogues gallery would that apply to, except like Kite Man and like the guy with the penny. What's the Batman Big Penny guy? Batman Big Penny guy. Joe Coyne, the Penny Plunderer. Pennies. Because, you know, the Batman Big Penny. He might do it. He might be saved by UBI. Who knows? But, like, Joker? He's loopy. Even, like, Dr. Freeze, who's, like, a sympathetic villain because of the animated series. Like, no, UBI is not enough because it's basic income. Like, you know, work with Wayne Enterprises to figure out the cure to this thing, but UBI? No, it's not. Can't fund a huge, expensive disease treatment with UBI. I think it's a misguided thing. Thing I want to talk about as well. Water. Okay. The moral status of relations to the state. Go. If the state, then, is a vast engine of organized crime and aggression, then the organization of the political means, well, then the means of the, then the means that, then this means, sorry, my brain was still interpreting means as the other usage of the word means. Not like this has the meaning of, but like, then this means that the state is a criminal organization, and that therefore its moral status is radically different from any of the just property owners that we have been discussing in this. This means that the moral status of contracts with the promises to it and by it differs radically as well. It means, for example, no one is morally required to obey the state, except insofar as the state simply affirms the right of just private property against aggression. Or, as a criminal organization, all of its income and assets derived from the crime of taxation, the state cannot possess any just property. This means that it cannot be unjust or immoral to fail to pay tax, to appropriate the property of the state in the hands of aggressors, used to obey state orders, to break contracts with the state. Since it cannot be unjust to break contracts with criminals. Morally, from the point of view of proper political philosophy, stealing from the state, for example, is removing property from criminal hands, is, in a sense, homesteading property, except that instead of homesteading unused land, the person is removing property from the criminal sector of society, a positive good. Reminds me of an argument about like stealing like sewage grates, I think it was, and selling them for scrap metal. Like, yeah, it's public property, it's mine. Give me the sewer grate. I'm gonna keep selling them. Oh, you're replacing it? Yeah, great. I'm taking that one too. Don't actually do this. It's terrible praxis, but like it is justified. So don't not do it, but don't do it. You're an adult. I can trust you to behave responsibly. And don't be surprised if you do it and then get in trouble. Like, yeah, the state sucks, but it's gonna beat your ass if you mess with it. Anyway, here a partial exception can be made where the state has clearly stolen the property of a specific person. Suppose, for example, the state confiscates jewels belonging to Brown. If Green then steals the jewels from the state, he is not committing a criminal offense from the libertarian theory. However, the jewels are still not his, and Brown would be justified using force to possess the jewels from Green. True. Yeah. In most cases, of course, the state's confiscation taking place in the taxation are mixed in one pot. It is impossible to point to specific owners of its specific property. Who, for example, properly owns a TVA dam or a post office? In these majority cases, then, Green's theft or homesteading from the state would be legitimate as well as non-criminal, would confer a just homesteading property title on Green. Based. Applying to the state, then, also becomes a fortiori morally legitimate, just as no one is morally required to answer a robber truthfully. He asks if there are any valuables in one's house, so no one can be morally required to answer truthfully similar questions asked by the state, e.g., when filling out income tax returns. Friendly reminder, don't do this. I don't care. I'm gonna say openly, I don't care if you guys don't pay your tax. Like, yeah, go ahead. Fuck. Doesn't affect me. I will not tax evade because of the way that things are organized in my country. It's kind of like more of a pain to tax evade than I would save. I would need to like set up a shell company or something like that. It would cost me so much. This is taken out of pay automatically. Wait, is it not picking my mouse correctly? I need to change my filters around. Okay, that should be better. Wait. Yep. Better. Woo! All this does not mean, of course, we must counsel via civil disobedience, non-payment of tax, or lying to or theft from the state. For these may well be prudentially unwise, as I have been saying, Hey, Tunix Um, no, I don't want 1,500 real followers and 100 average views. That sounds exhausting. What are you on about? Get out of here. Like, man. Also, man, Kick Chat really, like, not being good today. Eesh. But what we are saying is that these actions are just and morally licit. Relations with the state, then, become purely prudential and pragmatic considerations for the particular individuals involved, who must treat the state as an enemy with currently prevailing power. Many libertarians fall into confusion with specific relations with the state, even when they concede the general immorality or criminality of state actions or intervention. Thus, there is the question of default, or more widely, repudiation of government debt. Many libertarians assert that the government is bound to pay its debts, and that therefore default or repudiation must be avoided. The problem here is that these libertarians are analogizing a perfectly proper thesis that private persons keep their contracts and pay their debts. But government has no money of its own, and payment of its debt means that the taxpayers are further coerced to paying bondholders. Such coercion can never be licit from the libertarian point of view. For not only does increased taxation mean increased coercion and aggression against private property, but the seemingly innocent bondholder appears in a very different light when we consider that the purchase of a government bond is simply making an investment to loot robbery of taxation. As an eager investor in future robbery, then, bondholder appears in a very different moral light from what is usually assumed. Another question to be placed is the problem of breaking contracts with the state. We've explained above our contention, since inflexible contracts are properly title transferred and not promises, that therefore it would be legitimate in free society to resign from an army, despite the signing of a voluntary contract for a longer term. But regardless of which theory of contract we adopt, such considerations apply only to private armies in the free market. Since state armies are criminal aggressors, both in their actions as well as their means of revenue, it would be morally licit to leave a state's army at any time, regardless of terms of enlistment. It is morally the individual's right to do so, although again, whether such an action is prudential or not is another matter entirely. Common W from Rothbard, I guess. Oh, there's a guy. Let us consider in this light the question of bribery of government officials. We saw above that in a free society or free market, the briber is acting legitimately, whereas the bribee, who is defrauding someone, an employer, and therefore deserves prosecution. What of bribery of government officials? Here a distinction must be made between aggressive and defensive bribery. The first should be considered improper and aggressive, whereas the latter should be considered proper and legitimate. Consider a typical aggressive bribe. You know what? Yeah, the matter of the bribing government officials to become a beneficiary of the violence enacted by government is actually a thing that's been, like, rattling around my head the past few weeks. Because I've felt that libertarian ethics, you know, like, the earlier sections didn't do a great job. Okay. The sense where even if you're not the aggressor, if you enable the aggressor, sort of encourage the aggressor to act in a certain way and position yourself as a benefactor of that aggression, is it right for you to just not suffer anything for it? It's complicated, like, it's a mess. Anyway, I'm gonna go grab a snack real quick. I'm starving. So, let's hit him with the, but I am shivering. Ugh. Okay. Consider a typical. Okay. Likey. Consider a typical aggressor bribe. A mafia leader bribes police officials to exclude other competing operators of gambling casinos from a certain territory area. Here, the mafioso acts in collaboration with the government versus competing gambling proprietors. The mafioso is, in this case, initiator and accessory to governmental aggression competitors. On the other hand, defensive bribe has a radically different moral status. In such case, for example, Robinson, seeing that gambling casinos are outlawed in a certain area, bribes policemen to allow his casino to operate. A perfectly legitimate response to an unfortunate situation. Defensive bribery, in fact, performs an important social function throughout the world. For many countries, business could not be contracted at all without the lubricant of bribery. This way, crippling and destructive regulations and actions can be avoided. A corrupt government, then, is not necessarily a bad thing compared to an incorruptible government whose officials enforce the laws with great severity. Corruption can at least allow a partial flowering of voluntary transactions and actions in society. Of course, in neither case are either the regulations or prohibitions or the enforcement officials themselves justified. Neither they nor the exactions should be in existence at all. In some areas, a radical distinction between private persons and government officials is acknowledged in existing law and opinion. Thus, a private individual's right to privacy or right to keep silence does not and should not apply to government officials. Record and operations should be open to public knowledge and evaluation. There are two democratic arguments for denying the right to privacy to government officials. Right to privacy, which, while not strictly libertarian, are valuable as far as they go. Namely, 1. That in a democracy the public can only decide on public issues and vote for public officials if they have complete knowledge of government operations. And 2. That since the taxpayers pay the bill for government, they should have the right to know what government is doing. The libertarian argument would add that, since government is an aggressor organization against the rights and persons of its citizens, then full disclosure of its operations is at least one right that its subjects might wrest from the state, in which they may be able to use to whittle down state power. Jerky. It's okay, but it's just like Jack Links. It was the beef stick, not particularly jerky. Another area where the law now distinguishes between private citizens and public officials is of libel. We have maintained above that libel laws are illegitimate, but even given laws against libel, it is important to distinguish between libeling a private citizen and a government official or a... By the 19th century, we had fortunately gotten rid of the pernicious common law of seditious libel. It had been used as a club to repress almost any criticism of government. Currently, libel laws have now been fortunately weakened when applied. not merely to government per se, but also to politicians or government officials. Many anarchist libertarians claim it immoral to vote or to engage in political action. The argument being that by participating in this way, state activity, the libertarian places his moral imprimatur upon the state apparatus itself, but a moral decision must be a free decision, and the state has placed individuals in society in the environment in a general matrix of coercion. The state, unfortunately, exists. People must necessarily begin with this matrix to try to remedy their condition. As Lysander Spooner pointed out, in an environment of state coercion, voting does not imply voluntary consent. Indeed, if the state allows us a periodic choice of rulers, limited though that choice may be, surely cannot be considered immoral to make use of that limited choice to try to reduce or get rid of state power. The state, then, is not simply part of society. The brunt of this part of the present volume, in fact, is to demonstrate that the state is not, as most utilitarian free market economists like to think, a legitimate social institution, tends to be bumbling and inefficient in activities. On the contrary, the state is an inherently illegitimate institution of organized aggression, organized and regularized crime against the persons and property of its subjects. Rather than necessary to society, it is a profoundly antisocial institution that lives parasitically off of the productive activities of private citizens. Morally, it must be considered as illegitimate and outside of the ordinary libertarian legal system, such as adumbrated in Part 2 above. He limits and ensures the rights and just properties of private citizens. Thus, from the point of view of justice and morality, the state can own no property, require no obedience, force no contracts made with it, and indeed cannot exist at all. Mic drop, but it's this. Might be stick done. Yeah, stick. A common defense of the state holds that man is a social animal, that he must live in society, and that individualists and libertarians believe in the existence of atomistic individuals. Oh, I hear this one a lot. They haven't read libertarian theory at all. Uninfluenced by and unrelated to their fellow men. But no libertarians have ever held individuals isolated atoms. On the contrary, all libertarians have recognized the necessity and the enormous advantages of living in society and of participating in the social division of labor. Like, the foundation of libertarian ethics is the division of, well, part of the foundation. Division of labor. Let's go. The great non sequitur committed by defenders of the state, including classical Aristotelian and Thomist philosophers, is to leap from the necessity of society to the necessity of the state. On the contrary, as we have indicated, the state is an anti-social instrument, crippling voluntary individual creativity and the division of labor. Society is a convenient label for the voluntary interrelations of peaceful exchange market. Here we may point to Albert J. Nock's penetrating distinction between social power, the fruits of voluntary interchange in economy and in civilization, and state power, the worst of interference and exploitation of those. In that light, Knox showed that human history is basically a race between state power and social power, between the beneficent fruits of peaceful and voluntary production and creativity, on one hand, and the crippling and parasitic blight of state power on the voluntary and productive social process. Here's a problem that happens. You get social power, it's doing this, it's growing, and the way growth is, it tends to exponentiate. It's not strictly exponential, but like it exponentiates. And then state power, since it predates on social power, follows a similar exponentiation. But then it cripples that growth. So then you end up with trajectory, and then they diverge. Sucks, man. Anyway. Where was I? Parasitic blight on the voluntary and productive social. All of the services commonly thought to require the state, coining of money to police protection to the development of law in defense of the rights of person and property, can be. Hey, Garycom, I don't believe you. Here. Can be and have been supplied far more efficiently, certainly more morally, by private persons. The state is in no sense required by the nature of man. Right? The contrary. Turkey. Relations between states. Long chapter, but after this, I think I'll end the stream. No writing. Each state has an assumed monopoly of force over a given territorial. I hate saying that word, territorial. Areas varying in size in accordance with different historical conditions. Foreign policy or foreign relations may be defined as a relationship between any particular state A and other states B and the inhabitants living. In the ideal moral world, no state would exist, and hence, of course, no foreign policy could exist. Yippee! Given the existence of states, however, are there any moral principles that libertarianism can direct as criteria for foreign policy? The answer is broadly the same as in the libertarian moral criteria directed to domestic policy states, namely to reduce the degree of coercion exercised by states over individual persons as much as possible. Before considering interstate action, let us consider for a moment. Let us return for a moment to the pure libertarian stateless world where individuals and their hired private protection agencies strictly confine their use of violence to the defense of person and property. Suppose that, in this world, Jones finds that he or his property are being aggressed against by Smith. It is legitimate, as we have seen, for Jones to repel this by the use of offensive violence. Now, we must ask, is it within the right of Jones to commit aggressive violence against third parties? Against the answer must be no. For the rule prohibiting violence against the persons or property of innocent men is absolute. It holds regardless of the motives for the. It is wrong and criminal to violate the property of or person of another, even if one is a Robin Hood, starving, or is defending oneself against a third man. May understand and sympathize with the motives in any of these cases and extreme situations. Rather, the victim or his heirs may later mitigate the guilt if the criminal comes to trial for punishment, but cannot evade the judgment that this aggression is still a criminal act, one which the victim has the right to repel by violence if necessary. In short, A aggresses against B because C is threatening, aggressing against A. May understand C's higher culpability, but we still label this aggression by A as a criminal act which B has every right to repel. To be more concrete, if Jones finds that his property is being stolen by Smith, Jones has the right to repel him and try to catch him, but Jones has no right to repel him by bombing a building and murdering innocent people, catch him by spraying machine gun fire into it. If he does this, he is as much a criminal aggressor as others. The same criteria hold. Smith and Jones each have men on his side, i.e. if war breaks out between Smith and his henchmen and Jones and his bodyguards. Smith and a group of henchmen aggress against Jones and his bodyguards pursue the Smith gang to their limit. They cheer Jones on and we and others in society in compelling aggression may contribute financially or personally to Jones's cause. But Jones and his men right any more than aggress against anyone else in their cause of their just war. Kill others' property, finance their position, script others into their posse by use of violence, or kill others in the course of their struggle, capture the Smith. If Jones and his men do any of these things, they become criminals as fully as Smith, and they too become subject to whatever sanctions are meted out. In fact, if Smith's crime was theft, and Jones should use to catch him, kill innocent, then Jones becomes more of a criminal than Smith. Such crimes against another person as enslavement and murder are surely far worse than theft. suppose that Jones, in the course of his just war against the ravages of Smith, killed some innocent claim in defense of this murder that he was acting on the slogan, "Give me liberty, give me death." The absurdity of this defense should be evident. The issue is not whether Jones was willing to risk death personally in defensive struggle against Smith. The issue is whether he was willing to kill other innocent people legitimate. Or Jones was in truth acting on a completely indefensible slogan, "Give me liberty or give them death." Surely a far less noble battle cry. War, then, even a just defensive war, only proper when the exercise of violence is rigorously limited. Individual criminals themselves may judge for ourselves how many wars have met this criterion. It has often been maintained, especially by conservatives, that the development of the horrendous weapons of mass, nuclear weapons, rockets, germ warfare, etc., is only a difference of degree rather than kind from the weapons of an earlier era. Of course, one answer to this is that when the degree is the number of human lives, the difference is a very big one. But a particularly libertarian reply is that while the bow and arrow and even rifle can be pinpointed, if the will be there against actual criminals, modern nuclear weapons cannot. Here is a crucial kind. Of course, the bow and arrow could be used for aggressive purposes, but it could also be pinpointed against aggressors. Nuclear weapons, even conventional aerial bombs, cannot be. These weapons are, ipso facto, engines of indiscriminate destruction. The only exception would be the extremely rare case where a mass of people who were all criminals and had a vast geographical area. Must therefore conclude that the use of nuclear or similar weapons, or the threat thereof, is a crime against humanity, which there can be no justification. This is why cliché no longer holds. Not the arms, but the will to use them is significant in judging matters. For it is precisely the characteristic of modern weapons that they cannot be used collectively, cannot be used in a libertarian manner. Therefore, their very existence must be condemned, and nuclear disarmament becomes a good to be for its own. Indeed, of all the aspects of such disarmament becomes the highest political that can be pursued. But just as murder is a more heinous crime against larceny, so mass murder is so widespread as to threaten human civilization and survival itself, the worst crime that any man possibly can. And that crime is now all too possible. Or are libertarians going to wax properly indignant about price control, yet shrug their shoulders at or positively advocate the crime of mass? If nuclear warfare is totally illegitimate, even for individuals to defend themselves against assault, how much more so is nuclear or even conventional warfare for states? Joyke. Let us now bring the state into our discussion. Since each state arrogates to itself a monopoly of violence over a territorial area, so long as its depredations and extortions go unresisted, there is said to be area. Since the only violence is continuing and one way, directed by the state downward against open conflict within the area only breaks out in the revolutions, in which people resist the use of state power against them. Both the quiet case of the state unresisted, the case of open revolution may be termed vertical violence. Violence of the state against its public or vice versa. In the existing world, each land area by a state organization with a number of states scattered over the earth, each with a monopoly of violence over its own territory. No superstate exists with a monopoly of violence over. So a state of anarchy exists. And so, for revolutions which occur only sporadically, open violence and conflict in the world takes place in states, what is called national war or horizontal violence. Now, there are crucial and vital differences in state warfare on the one hand, revolution conflicts with private individuals. In a revolution, the conflict takes place within the same geographical area. Both the minions of the state, banana, and the revolutionaries inhabit the same territory. Interstate warfare, on the other hand, takes place between having a monopoly over its geographical area. It takes place between inhabitants of different territories. From this difference flow several important consequences. Cyber's world? In the interstate war, scope for the use of modern weapons of mass destruction is far greater. Or, if the escalation of weaponry is an intraterritorial conflict, becomes too great, the side will blow itself up with the weapons directed against the other. Neither a revolutionary group nor a state combating revolution can use nuclear weapons against the other. But, on the other hand, when the warring parties inhabit different territories, scope for modern weapons becomes enormous, and the entire arsenal of mass devastation play. A second corollary consequence, too, that while it is possible for revolutionaries to pinpoint their targets and confine them to their state enemies, and thus avoid aggressing against innocent, pinpointing is far less possible in state war. This is true even with old weapons. Of course, with modern weapons, there is no pinpoint. Hopper talked about this. The nature of war under democratic republicanism, sort of stuff. So, his takes are a bit more chunky. I don't know. Was more concerned with like the change in the nature of war, not in the reality of war. Makes sense? Like, you know, total war stuff. You don't have total war between private individuals, because what does total war even mean in that case? And you wouldn't aggress against people that you're not at war with. more enemies. Anyway. Tricky. Furthermore, 3. Each state can mobilize all the people and resources in its territory. The other state comes to regard all the citizens of the opposing country as, at least temporarily, its enemies. Okay, yeah, Hopper did talk about that. And to treat them accordingly by extending the war to them. Thus, all of the consequences of interterritorial war make it almost inevitable that interstate war will involve aggression by each side against the innocent civilians, private individuals, of the other. This inevitably becomes absolute with modern weapons of mass destruction. If one distinct attribute of interstate war is interterritoriality, another unique attribute stems from the fact that each state lives by taxation over subjects. Any war against another state therefore involves the increase and extension of taxation aggression against its own people. Conflicts between private individuals can be, and usually are, voluntarily waged and financed by the parties concerned. Revolutions can be, and often are, financed and fought by voluntary contribution to the public, but state wars can only be waged through aggression against the taxpayer. All state war therefore involve increased aggression against the state's own taxpayers, and almost all state wars, all in modern war, involve the maximum aggression, murder, against the innocent civilians killed by the enemy state. On the other hand, revolutions are often financed voluntarily and may pinpoint their violence to state rulers. Private conflicts may confine their violence to the actual crime. Must therefore conclude that, while some revolutions, some private conflicts may be legitimate, state wars are always to be considered. Some libertarians might object as follows: while we too deplore the use of taxation for warfare and the state's monopoly of defense service, we have to recognize that these conditions exist. If they do, we must support the state in just war. In the light of our discussion above, the reply would go as follows: yes, states exist. As long as they do, the libertarian attitude toward the state should be to say to it, in effect, alright, exist, but so long as you do, at least confine your activities to the area which human. In short, the libertarian is interested in reducing as much as possible the area of state aggression against all private individuals, foreign and domestic. The only way to do this in international affairs is for the people of each country to pressure their own state to confine its activities to the area which it monopolizes and not to aggress against other state monopolists, particularly the people ruled by other states. I lost my place. In short, the objective of the libertarian is to confine any existing state to as small a degree of invasion of person and property as possible, and this means the total avoidance of war. The people under each state should pressure their respective states not to attack one another, and, if a conflict should break out, negotiate a peace or declare a ceasefire as quickly as physically possible. Suppose further that we have that rarity, an unusually clear-cut case in which the state is actually trying to defend the property of one of its citizens. A citizen of country A travels or invests in country B, and then state B aggresses against his person or confiscates his property. Surely our libertarian critic might argue here is a clear-cut case where state A should threaten or war against state B to defend the property of its. Since, the argument runs, the state has taken up on itself the monopoly of defense of its citizens, it then has the obligation to go to war against, on behalf of any citizen. Libertarians must support such a war as a just one. But the point again is that each state has a monopoly of violence, and therefore of defense. only over its territorial area. It has no such monopoly. In fact, it has no power at all for any other geographical area. Therefore, if an inhabitant of A should move or invest in B, the libertarian must argue that he thereby takes his chances state monopolist, and that it would be immoral and criminal for State A to tax people in A and to kill numerous innocent B in order to defend the property of the traveler or investor. It should also be pointed out that there is no defense against nuclear war. The only current defense is the threat of initial destruction, and therefore the state cannot fulfill any sort of national defense function so long as these weapons exist. The libertarian objective, then, should be, regardless of the specific core conflict, pressure states not to launch war with other states, and, if their war break out, pressure them to sue for peace and negotiate a ceasefire as quickly as physically possible. This objective, incidentally, was enshrined in the old-fashioned international law of the 18th and 19th centuries, i.e., the ideal that no state aggress against the territory of another, which is now called the coexisting states. Suppose, however, that despite libertarian opposition, war has begun. The warring states are not negotiating. What then should be the libertarian position? Clearly, reduce the scope of assault against civilians as much as possible. Old-fashioned international law had two excellent devices for this purpose: laws of war and the laws of neutrality, or rights. Laws of neutrality were designed to keep breaks out strictly confined to warring states themselves, without aggression against states or particularly the people of the other nations. Hence the importance of such ancient and forgotten American as freedom of the sea, or severe limitations upon the rights of warring states, express neutral trade with the enemy country. In short, libertarian position is to induce the warring states to observe fully the rights of. For their part, the laws of war are designed to limit as much as possible the invasion by warring states of rights of civilians of the respective warring countries. As the British jurist F.J.P. Villay put it, the fundamental principle of this code was that hostilities between civilized peoples must be limited to the armed forces actually engaged. It drew a distinction between combatants and non-combatants by laying down the sole business of the combatants is to fight each other, and consequently that non-combatants must be excluded from the scope of military operations. In condemning all wars, regardless of motive, libertarian knows that there may well be varying degrees of guilt among states for any specific war, but his overriding consideration is condemnation of any state participation in war. Hence, his policy is that of exerting pressure on all states not to start or engage in a war, stop one that has begun, and to reduce the scope of any persisting war of either side or side. One corollary of the libertarian policy of states, the rigorous abstention. Wait, the dog's is offline? I'm talking about nuclear war right now. Anyway, how's it going, Sean? Ain't seen you here, but I might be seen. Let's see if you got a first time. No. Wait. Oh, it's the streaming booga. We got kick guys shilling sports gambling, and it's like just dumb as hell. I hate sports. I hate gambling. Beat all those guys. Yeah, I'm good. Just went offline? Damn. I'm getting close to the end of the chapter. I got 2 pages left. Anyway. One corollary of the libertarian policy of peaceful coexistence, non-intervention between states, the rigorous abstention from foreign aid from one state to another. Any aid given by state A to state B, 1. increases tax aggression against the people of A, and 2. aggravates the suppression by state B of its own people. So we're like hip deep in libertarian theory at this point. Let us see how libertarian theory applies to the problem of imperialism, which may be defined as the aggression of state B over state A over the people of country B, and the subsequent maintenance of this foreign rule. This rule could either be directly over country B, or indirectly through a subsidiary client state B. Revolution by the people of B against the imperial rule A, either directly or against client state B, certainly legitimate, provided again that the revolutionary fire be directed only against been maintained by conservatives and even by some libertarians that Western imperialism developed countries should be supported as more watchful of property rights than any successive native government might be. But first, judging what might follow the status quo is purely speculative, whereas the oppression of existing over the people of country B is real. Secondly, this analysis neglects the injuries of imperialism suffered by Western taxpayers, is mulcted and burdened to pay for the wars of conquest, and then for the maintenance of the imperial bureaucracy. On this latter ground alone, the libertarian must condemn imperialism. Does opposition to all interstate war mean that libertarian can never countenance change of geographical boundaries? That he is consigning the world to a freedom of unjust territorial regimes? Certainly not. Suppose, for example, that the hypothetical state of Moldavia has attacked Ruritania, annexed the western part of the country. The Western Ruritanians now long to be united with their Ruritanian brethren, perhaps because they wish to use their Ruritanian language. How was this to be achieved? There is, of course, the route of negotiations. Suppose that the Moldavian imperialists prove adamant, or libertarian Moldavians can put pressure on their state to justice. But suppose that this too does not work. What then? Must still maintain the legitimacy of the Ruritanian states against Moldavia. The legitimate routes to geographical change are 1. Revolutionary uprisings by the oppressed West, and 2. Aid by private Ruritanian groups, or for that matter, by friends of the Ruritanian cause in other countries, the Western Republic, either in the form of a volunteer person. Finally, we must allude to domestic tyranny that is the inevitable interstate war. Tyranny that usually lingers long after the war is over. Mendelssohn realized that war is the health of the state. It is in war the state really comes into its own, dwelling in power, number, pride, absolute dominion over the economy and society. Root myth that enables the state to wax fat of canard that war is a defense by the state of its subjects, The facts are precisely the reverse. For, if war is the health of the state, it is also its greatest danger. The state can only die by war or by revolution. In war, therefore, the state frantically mobilizes the people to fight for it against another, under the pretext that it is fighting for them. Society becomes militarized, statized, becomes a herd to kill its alleged enemies, rooting out and suppressing all dissent or effort, happily betraying truth, supposed public interest. Society becomes a camp. Values and the morale. Albert J. Knott once phrased it of an army on the march. And then we've got part 4 coming up next time on Stream. A bit. I got 4 kick followers today, but they're all bots, so fuck them. Good stream though. I'm gonna call it here. So good night, boys. Love you all.